Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined by Josh Blank today, research director for the Texas Politics Project. Happy Sine Die Interruptus.
Yeah, I was going to say, what even happened this weekend?
Did anything even
happen? I don't know. I turned my phone off. Anything happen?
So we are recording on our usual Tuesday morning. In the last 24 hours, legislature adjourned Sine Die only to be brought back immediately with a start time of 9 p.m. the day of Sine Die. For what Governor Abbott called in his press release, quote-unquote, special session number 1, which came with a notice that he expected the legislature to complete action on, again, quoting many critical items that remain after he sort of listed what had been done.
Right.
And made it clear that he said several special sessions will be required. So, for those of you in this world, work in the legislative world and the political world in Texas, there's been a lot of speculation through the course of the session, as there always is, about whether there would be a special session, when it would be. I think, the consensus moves, as it should, contextually. I think we spent a lot of time, in the last third or so of the session saying, well, he's going to call them back for vouchers. Right. They'll probably do that at the end of the summer. Yeah, this is looking very different. And for the historians or to just get to the historical question that will no doubt come up, near as I can tell, the record, according to the Legislative Reference Library, 6 special sessions. Governor Bill Clements in the 1989 session called them back 6 times, and that lasted a while. The final special session that year ended in June of 1990. So that was the 89 session. It ended about the end of session time the following year. Now, there were some gaps in there that last, so it's not like they were not perpetually in session, but still,
I'm just
6.
I'm just glad for our listeners that by the time they hear that, it'll be an appropriate time to take a drink.
Yeah, right. I hope so. Yes. So, what did the governor do? 2 items.
For special session number 1.
Yeah, in addition to this, this promise of several special sessions, he also said that, we're going to deal with this in a very orderly way, and we'll talk about the messaging and the politics of that in a minute. But so the 2 items, and this is verbatim, property taxes, listed as legislation to cut property tax rates solely by reducing the school district maximum compressed tax rate in order to provide lasting property tax relief for taxpayers. That is a real sort of stab in the eye at both houses of the legislature, but we'll get that. And then, interestingly enough, and the politics of this are also very interesting, border security. Mm-hmm. This is legislation solely for the purpose of increasing or enhancing the penalties for certain criminal conduct involving the smuggling of persons or the operation of a stash house. The use of stash house, one of those kind of uses of language this session that we kind of watched. So I want to unpack those 2 things, but let's also backtrack a little bit to almost where we were 72 hours ago, right? 2 of the 3 big issues going into the final weekend of the session, 2 of the 3 big issues that were pending were not resolved as we went into the session. Now, it looked for a moment, I guess on Friday and Saturday, like things were kind of coming together, and that the way that we'd been thinking about this a lot, like, this kind of game of chicken between the House and the Senate that had been going on was beginning to resolve itself. So, the chambers managed to attach the major components of grid policy to to the sunset bill for the PUC, OPUC, and ERCOT. And to go back to the last part, for those, few of you that listen, last week I couldn't remember if that sunset bill was one or the other. It was for all of them.
There we go.
Right. So just to touch bases on that. And that, without going too much into the weeds, we've got a lot to cover. That covered a lot of the ground that had been coming up in the House and the Senate. But nonetheless, the centerpiece of Republican campaigns from the top of the ballot to the bottom of the ballot in the last election remained unaddressed, and that was property tax relief. And this is where the drama very much was in the last moments, even through the final day of the legislature, as the lieutenant governor and the speaker, mostly lieutenant governor, were fighting on Twitter over, whether they should talk or not. And there was a lot of reporters chasing House members around the Capitol as meetings were held, and they could not reach an agreement. And Lieutenant Governor Patrick, in particular, pretty directly nasty about the speaker on Twitter and in a press release sense. Also, of course, no school choice or educational savings accounts, vouchers were passed. Essentially stymied in the House. The last major play attempting to get vouchers passed involved attaching the ESA voucher bill to Ken King's HB 100 on the House side, which provided several increases in education funding, including a teacher pay raise. King himself said he didn't want it. The House generally just didn't go for it. So no property taxes, no vouchers.
Right.
So, here we are. So, what are your first thoughts on this?
God, on which part of it? Can we focus it a little bit more?
Look, I think, let's focus on.
Let me you hear.
Let me focus on the politics of it.
Yeah, let me go back a minute. I think, it is interesting to your point, going into the weekend. This has been sort of the kind of open question. It's like they knew what was left that seemingly they knew what had to get done. And it seemed like they were moving towards each other a little bit on a number of these things because ultimately, in some ways, it's like they all agree they want to cut property taxes, and the question just is the mechanism, right?
Right.
And it seemed like the House, by throwing in the $100,000 homestead exemption, the homestead exemption being the Senate's kind of main vehicle for this, it seemed like they were kind of coming to the table and that maybe there would be something worked out there because ultimately, again, I don't think anybody wanted to walk home without a property tax reduction. And just for his little history on this, at the end of the last legislative session, or during the special sessions of the last session, we polled and asked, voters basically about how they rated the legislature on a number of things. And ultimately, near the bottom was grid reliability and property taxes, and especially for Republicans on property taxes. And then, kind of after that happened, I'm not pointing to any sort of causality here at all. I'm really not. But not long after that, the House, there was actually the Senate quickly mobilized an increase in the homestead exemption. But even after that, generally speaking, there wasn't a lot of sense that they had done a good job on property taxes. So it's not unusual that this has become such a big issue because it's been sitting out there for a while. And it's exacerbated, honestly, by the pandemic, by the huge increase in property values, all these things. Right. But it is interesting in the sense that it really is kind of, I think in some ways, an imperfect measure, as a broad measure could be of anything, but it's an imperfect measure of the dysfunction, right? Everybody wanted to do this, and they just could not get there. Yeah,
the politics of all this,
the voters don't care what the method is.
Well, no, they don't care. I think, they don't know. Like a lot of us, they don't know, and they don't really, you could even put it in front of them, and they're going to have, you're going to get some kind of response from some share of people, but I don't have a lot of confidence that people are going to,
Well, no, I'll just be
make
honest.
A judgment call about the, I think we talked about this last week, cutting, the amount of your homestead exemption.
Well, look, I'll be honest right now.
Versus the appraisal cap.
Let me just as a bit of meta for a second. The worst. So when you're an expert in something, quote unquote expert, which we're sort of experts in whatever you want to say. One of the things I think about being an expert is knowing what you don't know.
Yeah.
But the problem is the second you tell somebody you don't know something or you don't understand something, they're like, well, what kind of expert are you? Right? You idiots. Now, so we're not tax experts, but we look at this policy, and I got to say, when I looked at the special session call from the governor, I had to look at this and say, okay, maximum compression rate. Let me jog my memory. Is this the House version? Is this the Senate version? Right. It's like, oh, this isn't really either, actually.
Right.
But here's the thing, and the main point of this is just to say, I'm knee deep in this stuff, and I still need to go back and look at a bunch of PowerPoints, look at some things to try to like wrap my head around exactly what's going on here. So as an aside, if anybody else out there feels this way, like, oh yeah, I basically get what the argument's about, well, you're automatically like in the top 1%, top 2% of all voters, because the question just is, essentially, do they say they're going to lower your property taxes and that they did it? Number one. And number two, when you get your property tax bill, does it feel that way?
Do you notice?
That's all that matters. And how everything else in between is sort of just irrelevant, I think, for the most part, to most voters.
Right.
Okay. So, I mean, that's sort of one interesting thing, I think, about all the politics of this, right? Which is to say, I kind of understood the House Senate jockeying on this in the context of kind of different, coalitional elements, different timelines, I think, but then the governor comes in and says, in some ways, why don't you go back kind of to the thing that you were messing with before and do that some more? Right. And by before, I mean in 2019, essentially.
Yeah, and I kind of want to talk about, I'm not sure exactly how to get to that, or how to get to like the next point of that. But yeah, I mean, like if we step back and kind of look at this, I mean, one thing that, I think I'm sure I've said on this podcast, I've said it, several places, anybody listen that, in terms of the property tax relief fight on paper should have been very solvable. And I think there's a lot of people in the process that feel that way, that, as they were going back and forth, and you were seeing this in the negotiations, at least such as we got communication negotiation about this, that, you've got all these, levels of numbers that you can adjust. There's a lot of knobs to turn on this. Right. And it's really a function of how bad the relations are between the Senate and the House and between the leadership. Of the Senate and the House in particular, which we've referred to a lot in here. Don't really need to recap that. And, clearly pretty terrible. Right. And so, this has created an opportunity in a way, for the governor. And, we talk a lot about, the institutional pieces in here, and we come back to that. And this is such a great illustration. If you're listening to this, you're teaching a Texas government class, it's like, it's gold. Yeah. Because you get to say, hey, we talk about the governor being these different views of how powerful the governor is. But one thing we do know is that the governor's ability to intervene in an active way that exploits the public advantage that a governor has is really high at a moment like this. And the governor really jumped in there with both feet yesterday. Well, and that's the thing. I mean, it was sort of interesting. During the session, there was a lot of attention when the lieutenant governor sort of, hinted at the possibility of forcing a special session or, and everybody was sort of pointing to this as sort of like, well, either look how powerful Patrick is or look how crazy Patrick is or whatever you want to say about it. Right. But the reality is that, the dysfunction and the reality that they've gotten to the end of the constitutionally allotted time for them to do business on their own means that the governor becomes the first mover. He becomes the initiator. He also becomes the one who defines the terms of the debate. As you can see here with respect, he's not just saying deal with property taxes. He's actually saying deal with property taxes in this way. Now, look, the legislature is going to have a lot of flexibility to interpret that call to the maximum flexibility that they can give themselves. But nonetheless, this is pretty specific. This is pretty specific, right? Yeah. And so in some ways, once the legislature has kind of, in this case, really, failed, to deliver on some of its promises, it actually comes to the governor. And honestly, it is just such a win-win for him. Either he's the one who initiates them to do what they were supposed to do to begin with, or he tells them what to do and they fail, and he gets to point the finger and say, look how dysfunctional these guys are. Right. And which is not, it's not a great second choice, but you know what? As far as where the stink goes. Well, and, I think that this is another one of those cases where the differences in style between the lieutenant governor and the governor is really striking. The lieutenant governor has been on, pretty full-on frontal assault on the House and on the Speaker. Yep. And, he's not the first time he's done that, with this Speaker or in general. The governor is less rhetorically combative with the legislature, but nonetheless manages to accomplish a very chiding tone in his press release yesterday and in the communication. Yeah. That basically is sending the signal that, again, I think we anticipated the governor would be able to do this, and he is in pretty stark terms saying, y'all are just doing a poor job of handling this. And so now I am going to step in and I am going to modulate the agenda using the special special session powers. And, I'm just going to pace this for you.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to go and we're going to do this a couple issues at a time.
Right.
It's
patronizing.
It's almost yeah. It's I was going to say patronizing is a good word. It's almost pedantic in the way that he kind of just says. So we will just do these two things this session. It's almost like he's explaining to misbehaving children how they are going to behave.
Well, and part of that is the what they say sometimes like it's like the style is part of the substance, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is I think Abbott's clearly learned playing this game over and over again, right? I think in 2017 we had a similar issue over the bathroom bill and then Patrick sunk some important sunset legislation. And so they need to come back for a special session. And Patrick did something kind of pretty similar to what he did, yesterday. He said, okay, fine, we need to come back. I think the governor needs to call us back. Here's a list of all the things we should do.
Right.
And last time, Abbott acted a little bit differently on this. What he basically was, okay, he called him back. I think there were 15 to 19, special session agenda items. He gave them a month. They came back. I think they passed, somewhere between 8 and 10 of them. These are just kind of generic, what I kind of recall. Sure. And, and then you kind of saw the way it played out was really, I think the politics of that was really instructive because basically Abbott was able to say, yeah, I called him back for all 17 of these things. They passed 8. He got to highlight the ones he wanted to highlight. You can thank me for that. And, to the extent that other stuff didn't get done.
That's on them.
That's on them, right? Now, he could have done that again this time, right? But ultimately, I think one thing that's interesting about all this is, you can kind of see that, Abbott is a pretty calculated player. And I think he's being very, very selective in how he's approaching this, especially given the list that I think the lieutenant governor put out, which was an extremely political list.
Sure.
Not to say that the other one in 2017 wasn't an extremely political list, not to say that the agendas are generally not extremely political, but in the sense of who are you speaking to now by this moment, just in this moment, putting out the list on the case of the lieutenant governor. In terms of Abbott responding in whole or in part to it, there's sort of this immediate communication piece to this, but then there's a longer term piece to this, which is, okay, this all ends. There's a couple sessions. We'll talk about how many there might be, right?
Yeah.
They slide off into the election season, and then who gets to point to who did what and who asked for what and where the blocking was.
Right.
Right. But that's a later discussion.
And that stuff gets lost in the wash other than in Republican primaries. But
exactly.
Even then, it's pretty diffuse. So, speaking of Republican primaries, another minor story since the last time we met is the matter of the looming trial of the for now defrocked Attorney General Ken Paxton.
Right.
So the big story that broke right after we recorded last week, and we could have led with this, but we're legislatively focused guys. That broke between last week's podcast and today. The Attorney General was impeached by the House of Representatives over Memorial Day weekend after it was revealed that Paxton's case was the much speculated upon, quote-unquote, Matter A under investigation by the House General Investigating Committee, which listeners will recall has been very busy this session, having, just a few weeks ago, though it seems like a long time ago, expelled State Representative Brian Slayton. Now, lots out there with much more to come on this. The set piece for most coverage so far has been to underline the degree to which the Paxton affair, I should rephrase that, I guess, the Paxton matter.
There we go.
To draw from the Tribune exposed rifts or deep fissures among Texas Republicans. And I think that read makes a lot of sense, but, just those fissures are so multiple and it's so unclear which cleavage is in play at any given moment.
Yeah.
That, this is it's a very complex thing. Now, look, we step back, very historical, obviously. Only happened a couple times under the current constitutional regime. So we're in this situation now where there's what we know and what we don't know about the current state of play. And there's something in common with this that, helps us wrap up a little bit the previous segment, but that, there's really like a, this kind of, I'm not sure exactly how to describe it. There's this both the internal view of this and the internal politics of this inside the institutions. and the external politics, the appearance, public consumption of this, how the public might react.
Limits to public consumption.
The signaling around this in a public way, coexists in a very complex way with what's going on behind the scenes. And, the motivations being imputed to people, what people's incentives are inside the system, particularly when we start looking at trying to count votes in the Senate.
Right.
Now, the House was pretty unambiguous, which was interesting in and of itself. Of course, Democrats overwhelmingly voted for this with just one exception. Republican numbers very interesting. 60 on the motion to essentially ratify to pass the impeachment articles and send them to the Senate. 60 Republican yeses, 23 noes, one present not voting, and one person was absent with an excuse. And that also, I think, significantly included a record vote in favor by the Speaker of the House.
Right.
So, in terms of the internal politics of this, it's an uphill battle, and this is not saying that people externally aren't saying this, but it's a pretty uphill battle to call everybody that voted against Paxton a liberal squish and a crypto Democrat. I mean, it's just pretty hard to do that.
Well, I mean, I think, even the fact that is, look, the predictable response.
Sure.
But also, I think the idea here faced with, again, really overwhelming numbers in the House. And I think I want to make a real quick point here. The idea that somehow, any Speaker of the House was going to, roll, his or her own members to this kind of tune on a question like this, I think is really probably, I think it's overweighting the power of the Speaker.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the Speaker would need to know that these votes existed. This was not going to be a vote in which was going to be 60 Democrats and 30 Republicans, right? I mean, it needed to be something that looked like this.
Well, right.
And they needed to know in advance that it was going to look like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the run up to the vote happening, a lot of the discussions that I had with people that, sort of understand this, I think, was basically like, this is not happening if the Speaker didn't think he had the votes.
And I think,
and had the votes in a big way, not some marginal Dade Phelan and the Democrats impeached Ken Paxton. Now,
I think the dynamic.
I mean, and that is not stopping the critics from saying that, but.
Yeah, and I think the dynamics in the House are illustrative, though, right, of kind of what's going to be playing out going forward, right, in the sense that you did see, I mean, part of, when we were talking after we watched the hearing that took place, by the General Investigation Committee with their investigators, right, early in the week, I mean, the question I said to you is, well, geez, like, how do they not impeach him at this point based on what they've laid out, right? And ultimately the answer is, well, they did. But if you look at the argument from the opposition, sort of within the Republican Party here in the House, it sort of came down to a couple things. One, well, I didn't get to interview these witnesses. Do they exist even? Which is like, okay.
Right.
Set that aside. Two, this isn't the process we agreed to, even though this is actually the process we agreed to in the House rules, so whatever. Three, Ken Paxton was recently reelected by, overwhelmingly. It's like, okay, interesting.
You're overturning democracy argument, very Trumpian.
Yeah, well, and even that one I would say is less even. I mean, that was a mix of your overturning democracy, but even just saying, hey, he's popular. And then the other piece was, hey, do you know that we just got a tweet from Donald Trump and an email from Ted Cruz? Now, again, two people who have no part to play in this process, are not internal to it, are not privy to it.
Certainly not institutionally.
Not institutionally. But that, in some ways, but that is the argument. Now, in the House, right, again, I think the speed of this whole thing was, I think of all the criticism, I think that was the most valid, right? I mean, in terms of not even though the committee had been working on this for a while, to the extent that, they did issue the report, move to, the vote, that all happened very quickly. Now, I'll say one other piece I'll add to this. Yeah. Even, Representative Guerin going up multiple times to point out that the Attorney General had been pressuring House members to another. And again, somebody asked me about this weekend, what was the significance of that? I was like, it's not significant, but it's raising a consistent theme that galvanizes the House, which is this outside influence that, the governor, the lieutenant governor, lobbyists, special, whoever is telling the House what to do. So the idea of the Attorney General who they're talking about this matter is calling people on the floor is like, it might, sort of galvanize that idea. But what you're seeing here is, on the one hand, a fact pattern that produced an overwhelming vote in favor of impeachment when sort of the external, I think the external noise, the political noise was somewhat limited by the time frame.
Right.
And then you see this other thing, which is sort of the political argument and rationale. Now, what's interesting is as time goes forward, that political argument rationale, that public perception piece of it is going to become a bigger weight in the Senate trial, right? Now, again, not overtly. It's not like they're going to be presenting his poll numbers, as part of like the impeachment hearing. But this is what I think senators are going to have to deal with at this point is what does it mean when we say, well, we've got this sort of, very, very convincing record of misconduct on the one hand. But on the other hand, you've got the very popular former president of the United States saying, well, this guy's being railroaded. You've got, Ted Cruz, very popular state, senator saying the same thing. And also there's going to be an asymmetry in the public, right? Because ultimately, Ken Paxton and his allies are more than happy to go out into the conservative, ecosystem and say, hey, this is ridiculous. This is, I shouldn't be, this shouldn't be happening to me. These are all liberal Democrats, witch hunt, whatever. But, they're going to be hard pressed to, first of all, the state senators are going to want to stay away from this because they're supposed to be jurors, so they shouldn't be making comments about this generally.
I'll be, we were talking about this earlier. I'll be interested to see how long that holds.
We'll see how long that lasts, but generally you're going to see less of that. And also, I think, the other part of this is there is a truth to this, which is to the argument, which Ken Paxton is a popular statewide elected official. He's very popular with the base. And ultimately, do you want to be the Republican House member who becomes the public face of the attempt to remove the Attorney General? Not necessarily. I mean, so there's going to be some asymmetry out there to an issue that, again, we've talked about multiple times. Most people are not paying a ton of attention to. I'll make one more point on this, and also this is sort of a weird situation in which the fact patterns, they get worse as you get more specific. In some ways, usually the headline's the worst, and then you find out it's not as bad as the headline. This is a little bit different, I think, from just thinking about from the perspective of if I'm just a, Joe Q public, I'm just sort of, I haven't been paying much attention to this. And then I see over the weekend, Attorney General impeached, Ken Paxton impeached, and then I read the sub, and it's like, well, the Attorney General gave favorable access to the AG's office to a donor. A lot of people are going to say, yeah.
Isn't that what they do?
Isn't that what they always do?
Isn't that what the donor's paying for?
And then you say like, well, yeah, but like, it wasn't like he just made a call, he'll mobilize the office and say, is that really different? It's like, well, yeah, but it was at the expense of a nonprofit they were supposed to protect and also may have handed over like, investigative materials to his lawyer. And it's like, oh, yeah, I guess that is worse than, AG's office helps donor.
Right.
But most people are not going to go that deep, right? They're not going below the fold. They're not going to B26. Sure. And so I think there's some aspects to this that as time goes on, the political pressure could ratchet up if Paxton can hold together his coalition of interests and defenders, which, again, I think is a big
Well,
open question.
We were talking before this, there's this notion, and this is related to that, I think, who wants to get it over with quickly and who wants, who doesn't. And look, this can only move so quickly.
Right.
So as of right now, the Senate is going to convene to talk about rules for this. And the critical point here, the Senate is going to, by statute, writes the rules for this proceeding.
Right.
Put a pin in that.
Very normal. Just want to say this is how these things always work. Just for those of you out there, like, this is, these sort of bodies adopt rules for proceedings.
So they'll adopt the rules, and as of now, they're talking about, convening to do the trial in August.
Right.
So, it's going to be a long, hot summer of special sessions, probably.
Maybe.
At least one, and this going on in the background.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me make a low probability in terms of my certainty prediction, because it's fun and who cares. I don't know if there's going to be like a ton of special sessions. Now, I could be wrong. We'd be saying there'd be 6 special sessions. We could break the record. But part of it is, Abbott is smart with language. And, multiple special sessions could be 2. He'd already promised 1 before we got to this point on vouchers, and that would be at the end of the summer. We were talking about this before, and if you look at Patrick's list as a possible universe, and it may not be the list that Abbott's even. I'm not saying that Abbott's looking at Patrick's list, but I'm just saying to the extent that they share priorities, which they share a number of priorities, it's a place to look. Do I really see a special session in July that's totally focused on some of the sort of cultural, conservative red meat issues when nobody wants the legislature to be there? Number one, and number 2, it would be the only thing to focus on.
They could have a special session in July on the 2 items on the first special session in the House.
Well, that's absolutely, sure.
They don't pass them,
I'm talking about expanding the agenda.
Yeah,
beyond.
What do I think about that? I think to the extent that, I think you're right in that multiple could mean 2, and there is, to go back to the tone of that message. It's like if if you're good kids, maybe multiple will only mean a couple. But I don't know. I am digging in for a longer haul on this.
I'll just, I think...
And also, if you go back and remember, if you look at that Clemens session where he did call 6, there were gaps between some of them, and I think we will see that.
That's possible. The thing I would say is, just thinking about what was left pending out there, the stuff that's out there is pretty hot. It's the sort of thing that, if that was the only... we talk about this all the time, right? The legislature has a huge agenda, right? And people are usually focused on these bigger issues. But there's a sort of weird thing that happens where out of 5, 6, 7,000 bills, like 20 things that may or may not become law, kind of like maybe sort of keep people's attention. A lot of the stuff that's left, if that were just sitting there, if there was a July special session that was focused on returning prayer and the 10 Commandments, to the public school classrooms, that would get a lot of attention in the state because it wouldn't be competing with much else. And I think Abbott is a little bit just more thoughtful about it. And the thing is we didn't really talk about this much, but the other, piece of the special session call has to do with essentially creating a criminal offense in state law for crossing the border illegally. Now, there's, you kind of look at it, it's kind of interesting because there's sort of a workaround. The kind of key thing is what happens if someone says, I'm claiming amnesty. There's something that says, well, that's not our problem, which is like, we'll see what happens.
Right.
But here's the thing, right? If you just think about this, we've been talking about this a lot and we've seen it over the course of the summer. The number of times that Abbott... there's rarely an issue that could come up in which Abbott does not pivot it to the border situation. It's political gold for him. We've talked about it, blah, blah, blah. You've heard it. But if you think about what happens if they criminalize this at the state level, all of a sudden, when we talked about this dynamic before, even though the state is not supposed to necessarily be dealing with immigration law, eventually, sort of the ridiculousness of our commitment to it becomes part of the argument against how messed up it is.
Yeah.
So once we go from spending, $500 million to $1 billion to $3 billion to $4 billion, every time the number goes up, Texas can point to that and say, look how much we're spending on border security.
Yeah.
Now add to that, look how many people we've arrested for crossing the border legally. Look how many people we've had to pay to lock up. In special facilities in the state. And if those facilities seem like a mess, well, yeah, look at the problem that we have. So it actually, in some ways, it's
that we're having to do it because the federal government, et cetera, yeah.
Right. And so that creates the mechanism to actually increase, the nature of the crisis and use it in a way that doesn't necessarily just, is not just about throwing more money at it, although it will cost a lot more money to jail all these people.
Right.
But it is something there that, if you think of, honestly, if I'm sitting there and I'm an advisor to the governor, I think, well, if you get out of this and you force them to do property tax relief that you can claim credit for almost on your own, and you've been given you've been given the blank check more or less for your border security force, plus now those people have arresting power, so they're not just kind of like hanging out at checkpoints, which has been a big criticism about this. I'd be pretty happy to wait till the end of the summer and do the vouchers.
Well, and then, but I think...
I don't know. We're all just in the speculative world here, and I could be very wrong.
I think the other piece of this in terms of the border security part of that's just worth adding is that in terms of the internal politics of all that, the border security bill that they want to push out, and there were 2 House versions and then the main version, I think Senator Birdwell wrote in the Senate, that pushes the House back. Because what that means also is that the degree of cooperation with the Democrats that we've seen on some of the issues in the House, and the Democrats' role in supporting Phelan in the, obviously with qualifications, but in the broader universe of what's going on right now in terms of politics, border security, this bill is not a good issue for that because the Democrats do not want this bill to pass. And so this is a thing that will, remind Democrats and Republicans in the House that they don't always get along, right?
Yeah, I guess what I would wonder is, what politically or even politically competitive issues remain that would generate any sort of serious that would maintain that dynamic. If you think about where we are right now in the session, and the sorts of the options on the table for the governor within the realm of reason.
Well, the reason I raised that is because that actually then brings back, what the political dynamic is of, say, a social issue special session that would actually polarize the House more.
Yeah.
Right. Now, that doesn't, my suspicion is on stuff like that. I don't know. It'll be interesting. There's really no point in me trying to get in the governor's head on this, but you can make the argument either way for, doing, if he follows this kind of,
Yeah.
I am just going to make sure that you kids stay focused on just a couple of important things at a time, and he's wagging his finger at them. Part of the issue, part of that may be to like pair the issues in ways that aren't thematic.
Yeah.
If he can avoid it.
I just don't think there are enough issues.
So that you don't necessarily, I don't know. I mean, there's different ways that you can calculate the math on that.
I think it's probably because property taxes are the one that's not like the others, because Democrats would like to lower property taxes too. They just don't want to take a huge hole out of public ed to do it. And so,
and it's a more, and it's, it's just a more complicated public conversation that the public tunes into property taxes, and then, but what about, compression, and then it's over, right? Before we leave, I do want to go back and kind of finish, but that, and all that in a way does, again, feed back to the overlay or where we're going to be with this trial of Paxton and the very complicated politics of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we talked about the timing of the trial, and in terms of the things we know, we'll see what the Senate is going to do about rules. I mean, I think.
Can you explain why the rules are so important here? Because I've been having this conversation over and over again, and I feel like it's just.
Yeah, well, I mean. The rules are always important, obviously. And in this, look, let's just get one piece of the rules that everybody's talking about. And that's, how are the rules going to interpret the tension between the Constitution and the statutes?
Right.
Or, a possible tension between a Constitution that says, anybody, who is tried in the Senate will be convicted by 2/3 of the senators present.
Right.
But then you've got statutory language that, on one hand, requires the Senate to create, empowers the Senate to create rules for the proceeding, but also requires that all senators be present.
Well, yeah, and what I was thinking was, and I was looking at, I spent a lot of time looking at this weekend, it requires all senators to be present, and then if you look at sort of like, okay, now indent your bullet to make rules.
Yeah.
And then underneath that, to vote. Now, the one comes before the other, and the question becomes, what are the rules for voting?
And look, not to be too cagey about this, obviously the big question that, the reporters really love, and everybody loves for salacious reasons, is what about Senator Paxton? Right. Senator Paxton, right? Who, is going to be, on top of the fact that she's there, a juror, quote unquote, in the Senate of a trial of her spouse.
Right.
But also one of the counts involves Senator Paxton trying to, one of the counts that involves his relationship with Nate Paul, which is at the core of part of this, is that he, got Nate Paul to employ somebody that he was having an extramarital affair with, and that's not news. That's been out there for a while, but that's in the language of the indictment of the impeachment articles. Awkward, right? So there's that, and then the other person that I find this much more interesting, and I think eventually others are going to as well, and then people in this process. But I think publicly this is something that I think people, reporters have not really seized on, and that is, what about Senator Brian Hughes? Who is also mentioned, if not by name, but is mentioned in one of the articles of impeachment for his role in requesting the Attorney General's opinion that benefited Nate Paul, that the testimony and the investigators have said was completely ginned up by the Attorney General in his effort to help.
It's a straw man request. Basically.
Yeah, the straw man requester is the line used. But in testimony, in the testimony before the committee, when the investigators reported, they mentioned that, and this had already been reported, that it was Senator Hughes who had done the request, presumably at the behest. Now, it seems to me then that following the complaints of some of the House members, but in the trial where there will be witnesses, it then seems that one of the jurors very likely should be called as a witness. Yeah. And so, are the rules going to deal with that in anticipation of such a thing?
Right.
And there's a lot of scenarios that we can parse out here, and we're going to have a lot of time to do it, so we don't have to parse every. But I mean, I think those are, that question is significant, and just to go to the math and the conversation we have, that as you were saying, it's the denominator that matters here. So, if Senator Paxton and Senator Hughes are to, in some ways, limit their involvement or recuse themselves, does that lower the threshold? Does that lower the number of senators that are the senators present?
Right.
And the rules, and does that therefore, now it's not going to lower it a lot, but it would lower the threshold needed for conviction if 2 senators are removed from the denominator, it lowers it from 21 to 20. Now, that's not a huge difference, but it's...
Yeah, but anyone who thinks that they have a perfect sense of what the Republican vote split on this is going to be, come talk to me, because I don't believe you.
Right, because the things that we don't know, among the things that we don't know is how is that going to get sorted out? But that also points to, the bigger political question here, which is, where is Lieutenant Governor Patrick on this?
Right.
He has been... he has not handled this in the way that his national political ally, Donald Trump, has handled it.
Right.
Right. And that the lieutenant governor has not jumped out there. He's been a lot nastier about Dade Phelan than he has about Paxton, but nor has he done what I think a lot of people might have expected, which is to leap to the defense of somebody who, at least in ideological terms, is certainly more aligned with the lieutenant governor than either the governor or obviously certainly the speaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
And so he has not had much to say about that, nor has the governor. Right. So, this is where the outside perception, inside game, again, really raises its head, because the public communication is clearly going to be, or at least so far, and this has been actually, I shouldn't say implied. Lieutenant Governor is pretty explicit in the little that he said is, we'll let we need to respect the process and let the process play out. There isn't an internal conversation I've had with people in the process about this that has not been 95% about who wins and who loses from the Attorney General being removed, the governor getting to, name an interim replacement, the opening up of the competition for that office, all of the ripples, all the rippling, the kind of trickle down from that if so-and-so is in the Senate, decides they want to run for Attorney General, and it's a year where they have to be on the ballot and they have to make a decision, all of those things that happen when there's a vacancy, and, the rarity of those vacancies during the period of Republican rule.
Yeah, and I think what'll be, even harder to sort of, probably uncover, but it'll be interesting to watch nonetheless imperfectly is, throughout this legislative session and really, leading up to this legislation that has been going on for a while, there's been this sort of saying that goes around, well, there's only one vote that matters in the Texas Senate, and that's the lieutenant governors, right? And to me, this is an interesting test of that kind of power.
Potential edge case.
It's a potential edge case. I mean, and again, I think the House was, and again, especially the detractors were playing up this fact that this is not a normal vote. This is not a normal proceeding. And, to sort of, we're talking about the rules on this, it'll be interesting to see, listening to stories of what's going on there and reading tea leaves, how much the lieutenant governor attempts to influence the rules process in this, because I don't think that this is the sort of thing where the lieutenant governor is going to be able to say, this is where I expect you to vote on this one, and I'm going to punish everybody who doesn't go with me.
Yeah.
Now, look, I'm not saying that's not possible,
right?
But it seems highly unlikely.
And I would say this: I didn't bring my phone, and I'm ill prepared for the podcast. Forgive me, and I don't have the list in front of me of the senators that they named yesterday to be on the rules, to be on the committee that's going to write the rules. But I think the general look at that committee was that was not a particularly pro Ken Paxton committee. Now, you can read that one way or the other. You could read that it's the appearance and they're going to do what the lieutenant governor wants anyway. And so, doesn't matter.
Right.
But I'm not entirely convinced by that, but we'll see. We'll see what that all looks like. But that is something to watch.
Well, you know what it speaks to, and this is why this is such a mess.
Why is this such a mess?
Well, public corruption. No, but I mean, like, really, really stupid public corruption is the reason this is a mess. But it's partially a mess because ultimately, I mean, it's funny, talking to reporters this weekend about this, they're like, yeah, no Republicans will talk to us. And, I was like, yeah, like, well, you can talk to some Democrats. And the reporters were like, yeah, but why do I want to talk to Democrats about this? And it's like, and that's right.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. There are not a lot of Republicans who want to talk to you either. And I said this before, but, is this, I mean, to your point, there's a bunch of political opportunity that a statewide office being opened up in what is, a pretty jammed up Texas, in terms of these statewide Republican elected officials, holding office. That's very attractive. But that doesn't mean that there's a political, let's just say, path to be blazed by being the Republican who's the face of taking down Ken Paxton, at least not yet.
Right.
And so because of that, it is just sort of, there's all this sort of arm's length stuff going on where everybody's like, well, we'll let the process play out and, we'll kind of see what happens. And, but I don't think you're going to see a lot of people necessarily trying to sort of be at the forefront of.
Well, I mean, I think except that.
I mean, the House is interesting because the House has to prosecute the case.
The House has been.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think you'd be pretty hard pressed at this point to not say that Andrew Murr and Dade Phelan right now, are going to have a pretty hard time denying the fact that they looked at this and decided it needed to be done.
Yeah. And to me, and again, maybe I'm being too generous, but I think, there's just an easy case to say, like, look, when Paxton came to them and said, yeah, I want $3.3 million for this. And they said, isn't there an FBI investigation going on? Like, do we really want to, be blank checking this thing? And, Paxton, to his, honestly, I think to his detriment, doesn't seem to have, developed the relationships or maintained them or maybe never had them, in the legislature, even from his time there, to kind of go back and get some people to go to bat for him.
Well, what's interesting is, I think one of those relationships that goes back to their time in the House together is Senator Hughes.
Should we stop there?
So, it's so interesting to kind of think about this and talk about it, when you're sort of looking at it from inside the process and when you step back, I mean, look, I don't think, and I could be wrong about this, but, some of this is based on reporting and, I am hard pressed to think that when the lieutenant governor and the governor look at this and have watched Attorney General Paxton, that they both don't think he colored outside the lines. I just don't, and look, part of that is the obvious, like this is why the House was arguing about process rather than
I was going to say, of all the arguments that I said
Right.
that his defenders were making, none of them had to do with the merits of the claims or anything
but
like
that.
But on
the other, but the other side of this is that this has been going on for so long, and the politics of this in terms of, we haven't really mentioned that in the state, I mean, look, Republican Party of Texas, Matt Rinaldi, that universe of Texas Republicans have come out unambiguously defending Paxton and attacking the House.
Right.
Now, I was thinking back to after, I think it was after the 2021 session, when some of the, the so-called grassroots, I always feel like that's a little deceptive, but, the activist Republican groups on the right were criticizing the lieutenant governor, and he got kind of horsey and pushed back and said, some people are just never satisfied.
Right.
And so there's a willingness, an awareness that, like, the pressure from those groups that are, more or less aligned with the lieutenant governor, can be a pain in his ass.
Yeah.
Right. And from a guy that doesn't like people being a pain in his ass. Right.
Very clearly.
So how this is going to shake out, I think, at some point, there's a political benefit in making sure that you don't appear overly beholden to certain groups. And I'm just very curious in how the lieutenant governor is doing the math on this. I mean, obviously everybody is right now, and I don't have a good sense of it. And, I think there's a lot of speculation going on, all things being equal. I think it's not crazy to think that that vote in the House could be the leading indicator of a general sense among elite Republicans that we're ready to throw this guy under the bus.
Yeah.
Because he richly deserves it.
Oh,
But there are countervailing pressures, and I just don't know how they're going to weigh those pressures out. And look, the good thing if you're one of the people that wants to push Paxton out, whether it's for highfalutin ethical reasons or brutal self-interest, the fact that you have so many Republican votes in the House, and people can stand up and shake their fists and say we're going to primary every one of you.
Yeah, right.
Well, have at it.
Yeah, right.
I just don't know that that's going to last, and I don't know I just don't know how the lieutenant governor is going to parse it out.
Yeah, and I think, just in a simple sense, I don't think the lieutenant governor or the governor necessarily want to be on a ballot in, 2026 with Ken Paxton on it, right? I mean,
say what you will about the Dutton vote. Harold Dutton's House rep was, present not voting, but he did say directly, hey, Democrats, wouldn't you just rather have Ken Paxton on the ballot?
Yeah, and I think for Republicans, there's this sort of piece of this, which is, especially for the statewide, it's like, again, everybody, and people can get to the same place with different motivations and interests and sort of, they're different paths, right? But again, if you think if you're, if you're Greg Abbott, if you're, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, I mean, do you really want to essentially use your own political capital to save someone who has less political capital than you do, first and foremost, right? Who, again, between now and the time of the election, not only, might be charged with federal crimes,
right,
but could just continue doing, honestly, stupid stuff.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's the other thing about all this. I mean, I think, we didn't go over the details much and everything. That's fine. I don't think we have to. But I think the one thing that came out of the hearing, to me at least, someone who's followed this, last week was not so much that these things happened, but the fact that at every point along the process, there were one or multiple senior attorneys within the Attorney General's office saying, you shouldn't do this.
Right.
You can't do this. This is illegal. Don't do this.
And he overrode or fired them.
Right. So, ultimately, even an impeachment vote, I think you have to be sitting there as an elected official, even if you have a lot of sympathies with Ken Paxton and say, well, can I trust this guy? If we let him off here, what is he going to do? Yeah.
This really, it's, in pure political terms, the House going forward with this is a bid that shifts the risk-reward proposition here pretty fundamentally.
Yes.
And in terms of this whole, it also, so far the successful strategy for Paxton, at least, up until the weekend, has been delay, and continue to kind of behave.
And the House brought that up a lot during the hearing.
Yeah, with a certain degree of hubris. And, so now we get to the point of, where that delay may actually not help him now. Because the salience of it is going to increase publicly, and something that you were talking about the Fox News universe and all that, but the other piece of this that we were talking about before that's good to add,
is important.
And we know this firsthand, is that local television news is going to be all over every development in this. The political reporters are going to love this; they love it already, and you can say that's because they hate, they're liberal or whatever. I think it's more just because, look, it's a conflict story. It's also a corruption story.
It's a historical event.
There's reporters are going to be interested in this, and we know that a lot of Texans get their political news from local news. We actually asked about this in the December poll. Was it December? Yeah, and. That's a little bit of a wild card here, I think, in terms of the idea that that Paxton can just continue to play out the clock and hope that it breaks his way. I think the terrain on that tactic may have changed, but, again, we have prominent examples of that working, but eventually it works until it doesn't.
Well, I think that was part of it, though, is that, I think part of what the General Investigating Committee, part of the point they were making was, well, look, this is the legal and public strategy, which has been the same, basically, which has been to question the motivations of all of the complaints against him and to delay any sort of, let's say, under oath hearing about these allegations basically, once that became a request to the House to spend $3.3 million to continue basically to keep that out of a court of law, I mean, and again, this is sort of being cheeky, but like that just becomes a $3.3 million campaign contribution from the Texas House to Ken Paxton because he doesn't have to deal with this. And I think that's where,
Or in terms of the federal investigation, I wouldn't go so far as to say an accessory, but it makes it look
conspiracy?
like
I mean,
you kind of helped.
Yeah.
Right? That you were willing to go along with this. And, I'm using the word hubris, and I think that's really what is kind of at work here in terms of just going, no, we'll just have the state pay for it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I haven't talked, I've talked to many people in the process that just kind of scratch their head and go, why didn't he just pay for that out of his campaign funds?
Because there's a much better way to get campaign funds,
and
apparently.
cauterize that wound and, reduce your exposure. And, there's a definition of hubris somewhere, I can't remember who it is, that's the overweening pride of the damned.
Just as an aside, I'm pretty sure I've read that was not a legal possibility.
Yeah.
I mean, so that whole kind of like, well, why doesn't he pay for himself or whatever? I mean, this is one of those things that comes up. It's kind of like why the argument that like, well, there can't be a whistleblower suit against Ken Paxton because he's not really like this thing. It's like, yeah, but the suit is against actually like the state is a capacity.
The state was the plaintiff in the suit.
So it's not like you can just jump in and be like, I'll pay for that. Because if you think about it, there's going to be a lot of misdeeds that could be,
that mechanism, that's probably a good point.
So, I mean, it sounds reasonable. And that's again, I said one of the things I think was really interesting about the long arc of this was when, Speaker Phelan early on before the session said, I don't know how comfortable I feel, about this. Yeah. Right. I mean, to me, in some extent, I think, and the reaction I thought from the president, this is a minor thing, but I thought the reaction was like it almost missed the point, actually, of what that was signaling. It was sort of like, oh, here's the state of Texas is not going to pay these whistleblowers, even though they were wrongfully terminated. That's so Texas. Was kind of like, I think at the time that was kind of the feel. It wasn't, I mean, again, fast forward a few months, it's like, oh, no, it was because they were uncomfortable with the whole thing.
Right.
And I think
there's
sort of a torty response to it,
Yeah, there was a lot to read into it, I think, at the time. So I think with that, we've been going on a while.
It's hard not to. We could go on for another.
We will be, and we didn't even really talk about, we didn't even really round up the session, but I think
we'll have time here.
We'll have time to do that. And, we'll be doing more polling sooner rather than later, in which we'll have more to feed into.
We haven't canceled all of our summer plans yet.
What the public response looked like and to what they have and have not done and also to this. So with that, thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks, as always, to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. If you're listening to this podcast on a service, we usually post these podcasts with some supplemental material. And, in this one, I think we can probably put some links to some of the documents that we've discussed and maybe even a couple of polling results. Find all that at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Click through to the polling section. There's a blog section where we post a lot of this stuff. So thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.